So welcome everybody to today's exciting webinar and a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're dialing in today. We are all very excited today and gathered here to listen to our expert speaker, Dr. Rachel Jewix, who will be teaching us the art of writing effective abstracts and conducting review of literature. To quickly go over some basic stuff, today's webinar is 60 minutes long. The audience is muted while the webinar is going on, so please add your comments to the chat box. We have a bit of a time at the end for question answers, but while you're listening to the speaker, if you have any questions, feel free to pop in your questions in the Q&A box down on your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to everybody after the recording today is done on the SVRI website. We would love to know who you are. So please introduce yourself in the chat box and let us know where are you dialing in from. So welcome everybody. To quickly go over the agenda, is we will give you a very short overview of the SVRI research grant, just the basics. And then our executive director, Liz Dartnell, will be introducing our expert speaker today, who will be then taking us over her presentation on how to write effective research abstracts and conduct reviews of literature. This will be followed by a question and answer session. I do hope you enjoy today's webinar and we look forward to the rich interaction today. Thank you. So to quickly go over SVRI grants, I think most of information about SVRI grants is already available online. As you already know, SVRI supports action-oriented, policy-relevant research that aims at widening and strengthening evidence base on violence against women, violence against children, including child sexual violence. We also would like to see research that examines the intersections between violence against women and violence against children and all other forms of GBV prevention. This is to say that while we're saying violence against women, we are not as an organization that understands gender as binary. So we welcome applications from all researchers who would like to research gender in its multidimensional aspects. The focus has to be on GBV prevention and response efforts focused in low and middle income countries. There are several resources available for you in your preparation for the SVRI grant. I would like to particularly point out one resource to you, is that the SVRI, along with its partners, we have created several research priorities and agendas for the field using extensive participatory methods to ensure that these research agendas are informed by multiple and diverse voices from the field. We therefore encourage you to refer to these agendas when considering applying for an SVRI research grant, as we use these agendas as a framework to guide our selection process. As you know, SVRI supports researchers and research institutions, including NGOs, based in low and middle income countries. We follow the World Bank classification. So before you apply, using the World Bank classification, please determine the eligibility of the country where research will take place, whether your country is eligible to apply for this research grant. As I said earlier, we encourage applications from LMICs. That doesn't mean that we do not like researchers from the global north. It's just to say that we encourage consortia applications that are north and south partnerships and even south and south partnerships. The understanding is that the expertise in the global north on research needs to be passed on. Capacities of researchers, research institutions, young researchers, emerging researchers from LMICs need to be built. And therefore, such consortiums of North and South partnerships are very welcome to SVRI grant. We would like to see more LMIC-based organizations and researchers be the lead applicants who are the thought leaders on their own research grants. Grant application guidelines have already been published. They are available on SVRI Research Grant website. I'm sure in the chat, the links to all these websites are being shared right now and will be shared over the course of this webinar. A gentle reminder to everybody who's considering applying to the SVRI research grant. is that the SVRI does not accept any grant application sent to us via email as an attachment. What we instead use is an online platform called Proposal Central. There is a link that is displayed on the screen, plus we will share the links with you on your chats so that you know exactly where to go. On that link, you will be guided as to how to create a login. Please rest assured that the login created for Proposal Central is not sold for commercial purposes, so will not spam your inboxes. But we do not accept applications sent to us via emails. Um, and just a reminder that the last date for application is 9th July 2024, and the deadline is midnight, 11:59 p.m. South African time. So kindly make a note of it. I hope you enjoy today's workshop or today's webinar, and it helps you to strengthen your application process. I would now like to invite our Executive Director, Liz Dartnell, to introduce Rachel to us.
Thank you so much, Preeti, and thank you, everybody, for joining us online. We have a really great turnout, and it's wonderful to see you all for this really important webinar. I'm so honoured to be introducing our distinguished speaker, Professor Rachel Jukes. I have no doubt that many of you, if not all of you on this call, are aware of Rachel's prolific career, which has been dedicated to advancing research and policy in violence against women and girls. Over Rachel's expansive career, Rachel has and continues to contribute extensively to our understanding of violence prevention and women's health, and has made a profound impact globally. It is with a great pleasure and privilege to have you with us, Rachel, and thank you. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Rachel Jukes.
Well, good morning, everybody. Let me just share my screen. I hope everybody can see this. So I have been asked to talk to you today and give you advice on how to write effective abstracts and conduct literature reviews for preparing an application for the SVRI grants. So when Liz and colleagues asked me to do this, my first question was, well, why stop at the literature review and the abstracts? What about the rest of the proposal? And I was reminded that Heidi Stockel did a webinar last year on how to write the rest of the SVRI grant application proposal, how to do a winning application. And that webinar is available on the SVRI website. So I am focusing today just on this front end of the application, the abstracts and the literature review. So I want to start by giving you some general tips about writing your proposal. The first thing is that you, when you are reviewed by your reviewer, it's very important for you to think about the person who's going to be reading your proposal as you write it. And to remember that person most likely doesn't know you and doesn't know anything about you. And so you need to make sure that everything you need to say and convey to persuade your reviewer that you've got a winning proposal and it should be funded is present in your application. One of the key things is that all of the work we do under the SVRI is guided by the SVRI principles, and the most important of which is that recognition that research on violence against women and violence against children is extremely sensitive, and these forms of violence are founded in gender inequality and the patriarchal nature of our society. And we want to fund research and researchers who express the same ethos as the SVRI. So one thing you have to do in your proposal is to convey the fact that you have a sensitivity towards violence against women, violence against children, if that's part of your focus, and that you have knowledge of violence against women and violence against children, and some track record in research or programming. So that's not to say we only are going to fund people who've been in the field for 30 years. In fact, generally, we don't fund people who've been in the field for 30 years. We're far more interested in funding emerging researchers and seeing that capacity in the field is built and extended through these grants. But you must demonstrate that you understand the issues, you understand, you're empathetic towards these very sensitive issues that you wish to conduct research on, that you have knowledge of the issues, and that you have some track record in research or programming around violence against women, violence against children. The second thing you need to convey is that you have the necessary research skills to do the research. So we know two things about you. We know a bit about you from your CV, and we can have to decide how skilled you are as a researcher from the way in which you write your application. So it's incredibly important that you demonstrate that through a competent review of the literature, which doesn't mean that you demonstrate you've read everything. Nobody now could possibly read everything in our field, but you must be able to show that you're familiar with key documents and you understand how to indicate appropriately through referencing that you have read them, and you can draw key and support key arguments in your literature review by appropriately referencing appropriately authoritative documents from the field. You need to demonstrate you can synthesize the findings and that you can reflect on their implications, and that you're able to design a study and write the proposal. So you need to think about all of this. The other thing is you have to demonstrate that you are innovative, that you've got ideas for doing research that hasn't been done, for extending knowledge, because at the end of the day, much as we want to build capacity, we're trying to extend knowledge in the field. And you need to demonstrate that you've got ideas that you want us to be able to support. So you need to be able to sell your ideas to us. And if you're trying to develop a test and intervention, you have an understanding about interventions in the field of violence against women, violence against children, whether they're for prevention or interventions to provide support to women and children who are exposed. And you need to basically convince your reviewer that your study should be funded. And reviewers are convinced by good ideas, by innovation, and by a competently presented proposal. So presentation of the proposal is also very important. You need to do it in a font that's easily readable. So 11 or 12 point font. Over the years, I've seen some SVRI proposals written in 9 or 10 point font with almost no spacing between lines. It's extremely difficult for reviewers to review that type of thing. So think about the font. Use subheadings, because the way in which you're given a total number of characters for each section that you have to write to, and you're not restricting it to a given number of pages. And so spread it out properly with appropriate line spacing between paragraphs, subheadings, and where relevant, use diagrams, because sometimes a diagram can convey most effectively what you're trying to do, why you want to conduct research, if you think there might be pathways that you want to be able to elucidate through your research, or if you're evaluating an intervention, develop a theory of change, show it to us diagrammatically. Don't repeat things in the proposal. It's very frustrating when the same paragraph appears in different sections. Your reviewer reads the whole proposal so that if you are going to talk about ethics, for example, in the ethics section, don't talk about ethics in any of the other sections. And there's a note that you are given quite generous character allocations for some of the sections, and you definitely don't need to write to the full number of characters. So write what you want to convey, and if you find that you're still, 200-300 characters short of the total you're allowed to write, that's fine. You don't need to say any more. Now, the last point on presentation is that you must check your spelling and grammar, because somebody has to read the proposal and it's extremely difficult to read if it hasn't been spell checked. Fortunately, with AI, we have some really good spell check and grammar check tools. And I encourage you in particular to look at Grammarly. It's available on the internet. You can download the basic version for free. And actually, the basic version is really good. You can run it all the time on your computer. It will always check your spelling, and it will pick up sentences where it recommends that you look at the grammar. If you want to get really good advice on how to adjust the sentences, you need to go for a premium version that you pay for. But the version that's available for free is really pretty good too. And so I do strongly recommend that you use a tool like that, because it's really helpful. So the first thing you find you have to do on the website is to draft a provisional title for your proposal. And my suggestion is that you put together a title which you have to have when you start, and that you acknowledge the fact that you might actually want to change the title by the time you've finished developing your proposal. It's absolutely fine for you to do that, but you just need to make sure you remember to adjust it. Titles are important. It's very useful to indicate the country of the work you want to do in your title. It's useful to indicate the research methods. A qualitative study of ... in Egypt. That would be a good title. So you've got the methods, the subject you're studying, and the country. And that's really helpful for reviewers. So when you look at your guidance, you get told about the character limits for what you have to do. And I want to emphasize to you that the character limits are all presented with spaces. So you need to be careful, because if you run a character count using Word, you get them with and without spaces, and spaces take up space. So just be careful there. You're not allowed to go over the number of characters. And by that, I mean that the website won't let you do that. So you do need to be very careful about your character limit. As you prepare your proposal, and I think most people prepare a proposal just in a Word document and then at the end would copy it onto the website. Our rough guide is about 3,000 characters, is roughly 500 words, and that's sort of almost a page of A4. It's a bit short of a page of A4. And 650 characters are about 2 A4 pages, and that's about 1,000 words. So whenever you see in the application 3,000 characters, think 1 page. 6,500, just think 2. What you see when you get to do the prepare it is that you get to write a page for the abstract, roughly, about 2 for the background. You can put in another page on the section which is about the innovation and the contribution. You're given a page for aims and objectives, but I don't think that we really ever expect you to use a page for that. Research plan, 2.5 pages. Please give us enough information to review it properly. And you can go up to 2 pages on ethics, although again, I think generally it would be better to be succinct, you can use lots of subheadings and you wouldn't need 2 pages. And then there's a page for the capacity statement. So how do we go about thinking about the background? When we look at the brief that's on the website, you're told that the background must clearly outline what's already known about the research topic, justify the need for the study. It must provide the foundation of the study, offering insight into the broader area of research, summarizing the existing literature, show how the research will address a research gap. 650 characters, so that's just about 2 pages. And then you get the related section around the innovation and the contribution, where you need to say what's really innovative about the project. And this is critical. We want to fund innovative research. What will be the project's contribution to building evidence for GBV prevention and response in low and middle income countries? We hope the project will be locally useful for you, but we hope that there will be lessons and learnings that will be of value more generally across many other countries that will share similar situations to your countries. It is said that you should outline the strengths and limitations of your study. I would recommend you focus on the strengths. So this is what we're looking at. Your 650 characters, which you're about 1.5 to 2 A4 pages, really translates into about 6 paragraphs. So your challenge in the background is to work out what to put in the 6 paragraphs. And I recommend that you start off with a clear statement of the overarching problem that's going to be investigated in the research. So an example would be sexual violence experiences have been reported by 1 in 3 students in schools in the Eastern DRC. That's a very clear statement of a problem. And clearly your reader now knows this study is going to be about sexual violence based in the DRC. We're going to be thinking students in school. You want to follow this with a statement of the policy or service context of the research, showing that the research is linked in some way. This provides an indication of the relevance of the work. So something like, I've made this up, but despite sexual contact between teachers and students being prohibited in law for 20 years, sexual harassment of female students remains a very common occurrence. You need to indicate then the location of the research and the area of the work. So this proposal describes a qualitative study that will focus on understanding sexual violence against adolescents in the Eastern DRC. That would be an example. And then you need to say why the study is needed. Understanding more about the context in which sexual harassment occurs is essential for developing prevention interventions, strengthening policy implementation. These are all examples, but you can see the statement of the problem, the policy context, the location, and why the study. And if you write this, then your reviewer is already orientated and hooked in by the time they've read paragraph 1. Then you have a set of 3 paragraphs that I recommend you dedicate to the specific background to the problem. What's known about the problems being researched? You must provide a definition. And this is not the definition that the WHO produced or the UN signed up to in 2002. We want to know what the definition is that you will use in this study. So not the definition in the World Report of sexual violence, but what are you going to call sexual violence when you're studying it here? If it is known, what is the prevalence in the country? And it could be national prevalence if that area of violence has been studied in a DHS or something, or it might be prevalence you found in your pilot study with 200 people that you conducted, before putting this application together. What do we know about risk factors, about who's at risk? And again, you want to show anything that's known locally about who's at risk. But if you don't have local information, we do also want to know that you are familiar with the literature on risk factors. So if you are able to say, provide a summary based on what you've gleaned from reading other literature, then that is very valuable here too. And sometimes somebody will provide an overview of the risk factors for that type of violence based on the literature, and then say what's known about it in that particular context, especially if what's known locally is more fragmentary. You might want to talk about drivers and contributing factors and how they work. So, you know, a risk factor you might think of as being, for example, being unemployed. And the broader context is to understand the role of poverty in increasing the risk for violence, different forms of violence against women, and how poverty works to, for example, increase household strife, how it might be related to the formation of or adoption of particular constructions of masculinity that might be more linked to the use of violence. So whatever is locally relevant. And the consequences. We want to know you understand the consequences. So sexual violence at school to lead to a higher dropout rate from school, for example, which impacts socioeconomic development across a lifespan. So you need to show that you understand these. For your setting, we want you to, and depending on the type of violence, talk about the complexities. What makes violence more complicated? If you're studying IPV in Nepal, for example, you might say, well, most of the literature globally is talking about IPV in intimate relationships. But actually, in Nepal, it's important to understand that this is linked up to violence that women may experience from mother-in-laws or other family members. So you might want to talk about that, and then you would have to explain how that was relevant and important for the study. If your team has already conducted research into the area, this should be highlighted. What did you do? You've been doing a pilot study, developing a qualitative research to adapt an intervention for your setting. Describe how you did the work, who you did it with, how many people were involved. Did you conduct any research linked to it? What were the findings? If it's published, please reference it. You will find that if you're involved in any major study that becomes one of the studies that people hear about and know, that your reviewer will Google you and Google look up publications if it's known there's been a previous evaluation. So just be aware of that, and it's really much better to talk about the previous evaluation, even if you say we're still analysing the data or we're still conducting the research, because at the SVRI, we don't want to fund work that's already been funded. And so it's much, much better for you to say, you know, we did develop the intervention and we did an initial evaluation with 50 students at university who were put through our intervention, and now we're asking for funding for something that's bigger. And then you're not hiding the fact you've done the initial work, but you're showing us that this piece of work now, or the future piece, is going to be building on what's been done, and that will count as a positive for you. So please make sure you explain it. And so what are the key things about how you actually put your literature review together? Well, I think you always need to work out what you need to know. And the plan of the paragraphs actually helps you do that. So if I flick to the previous slide, you say, okay, I've got to say what the definition is of sexual violence that I want to study. So let me find out how other people have defined sexual violence for this type of work. And then I can decide what definition I'm going to use in my study after looking at what other people have done. And so you then want to go into a search engine. And I recommend using PubMed and Google Scholar as your first two sort of pillars of your research, your literature search, to find out who else has done work in your area, what definitions have they used, how can that inform what you're using. And very often also, if you're going to use a questionnaire, for example, imagine that you're trying to evaluate an intervention to prevent sexual violence experienced by adolescents in schools. If you can decide which measure of sexual violence you're going to use to assess the sexual violence experience and look at what that covers, you can frame your definition around that. And that might be quite a good way of getting a definition. You'll also see about how definitions have been described in the work of other authors who've used the same tool. So plan your paragraphs. So you could say, the first thing I'm going to do is a little literature search on definitions, and then I need to do a little literature search on the prevalence of IPV in Rwanda, DRC. Then I need to do a literature search on risk factors and drivers contributing factors, and then something on consequences. So you are, instead of doing one huge literature search, you're doing little searches that are targeted towards the key areas that you want to write about. So why these search engines? PubMed covers a really wide range of journals, and most of the social science journals are in PubMed. And in fact, so much of the literature published in journal articles on violence against women has been published in articles that are indexed in PubMed, that it is a really good source of information. It gives you access to abstracts, and so many of the articles that are published within the health field are open access, that very often you can get a full version, a PDF of the article you want to look at. So PubMed is really useful. If I had to suggest one second research engine, I would actually use Google Scholar, because it's really comprehensive and it spans the whole of the social science field and will come up with the odd book or book chapter reference as well. And Google Scholar has links to many abstracts. The problem with literature that is available on Google Scholar that you might not find through PubMed is that you might have a paywall to prevent you getting access to the article. That might not be a problem if you've got a university library that can help you get through the paywall, but most people don't have that. But I recommend that you certainly start with PubMed and see what's available open access, and then see what you can add to that. If you want to access other reports, you'll find you can get them from Google, but you have to be very careful with keywords in Google, because if you put in your normal keywords like sexual violence, adolescence, Rwanda or DRC, you'll find Google tells you they've got like 32,000 hits. So you need to be quite careful and to use keywords quite carefully in Google, because it can get a bit overwhelming. So choosing your search terms carefully can really help you, as well as with the as well as in terms of choosing the search engine. You don't need full sentences with keywords. With searching, you can just use keywords. And it's important to remember, certainly for an SVRI application, you don't need to reference and read everything. You're not writing the literature review for your PhD. 1 reference per point is fine. We don't need 4 references to, you know, 1/3 of women experiencing IPV in their lifetime. But I do encourage you to read more than 1 paper, as you want to be sure generally that you're citing something that's well accepted. And if you're going to choose 1 reference, don't reference the small study interviewing 6 people that your colleague in the office next door did for her master's thesis. It's much, much better to go for something that's more generally accepted and based on a larger sample for justifying for quotes and things that are you want to justify and back up with referencing in an application for funding. And when you use Google Scholar, it generally tells you how many citations work has got, so you can feel your way through what might be the more authoritative sources. So those are 3 paragraphs around your literature review, and I can't tell you exactly the details to go in there because it does depend on what it is that you are writing about, but it's a rule of thumb that there will be 3 of them. So you then will come to paragraph 5, where you do need to make sure you talk about where else has the problem been recognized. The international literature. None of you will be doing research in a country where you've got a problem that doesn't pertain in other settings. And with the field of violence against women, violence against children having grown so exponentially over the last 20 years, in general, almost everything you want to look at, somebody else will have been thinking about. So you must look at the international literature. Where else is what you're considering a problem? What's been learned from research there? What have people done? And what are the implications of that for your research? Has it highlighted global gaps that you're going to help to fill? Has it shown that policies can be implemented? And maybe your research is key to being able to develop a policy for your setting. So think about the implications of the work. And then you get to your last paragraph, which should also always be your concluding paragraph. And you must summarize what you've written above in the previous 5 paragraphs. I don't mean repeat it, I mean highlight the most important points for your reviewer to hone in on. And you must conclude with a statement describing the need for the research, taking into account what's already known about the issue. So remember, you've got 2 pages for this. Your arguments must always be presented in a clear and logical sequence. I encourage you to use subheadings because it makes it much easier for reviewers to read sections. So if you do your introductory paragraph, and then you might want to dedicate your next paragraphs to sexual violence in the Eastern DRC. Make that a subheading, and then you present your synthesis of what's known about it. And remember to reference everything that you say. Your next section is on innovation and contribution. So it's really important that you show us how your work will strengthen policy and practice or enhance methodology within the field. You've got 3,000 characters, which is about 3 paragraphs. It's nearly a page. And how you approach this will differ depending on whether what you want to do is observational research or intervention based research. So if you're doing an observational study, and that by that I mean any form of qualitative research, which would be observational, or sort of quantitative epidemiological research, which isn't conducted in order to evaluate an intervention, that we would call as observational, regard as observational. So in terms of justifying the innovation, what you need to do is to say, first of all, what have been the responses so far to the problem you're interested in the country where you want to conduct it? So if we're talking about doing work on sexual violence at schools or sexual harassment against adolescents in DRC, the question would be, what has been a response from the national government? There must be a National Department of Education. What's been their response to sexual violence against schools? Is there a Schools Act that outlaws sexual conduct between teachers and learners? Is there a council regulating educators that takes action against educators that are having sexual relations with students at school? What has been the response? And if there hasn't been a formal state sector response, you must say that as well. And then what's been the response from the community sector? Are these issues things that NGOs are talking about, that social media is commenting on? In which case you need to describe that. And essentially what you're doing there is showing that there are other people in the state or community sector, could also be other researchers who are talking about the issues, but who have identified this as being a problem and tried to do something about it, or and then you get onto the limitations of these responses. So if there's a big gap, because they haven't really done basic stuff to outlaw sexual relations with students, for example, that can be described as a limitation of the response. These sections then build up to the next big thing, which is that you need to show how your research findings could be used to strengthen that response. Now, when we say this, we don't mean that you have to actually strengthen the response using your SVRI grant. I think if you can do, that's wonderful. But most of us, when we're doing research, we're not in a position to write legislation, for example. But you are in a position to present your research findings back to the National Department of Education, for example, in order to try and motivate for action. You're in a position to do the research and present your findings back into the community sector, to NGOs, any organized groups within the country. You might be able to use your research to help them put forward arguments for legislation. And you also need to consider whether it would be advisable to engage stakeholders from government, say, at the time when you're planning your study, so that they can be part of a community advisory team, if not your investigating team, as part of the research, because you're much more likely to get action after research if you fuel the appetites of your stakeholders for your research findings from the point when you design the study. So you need to think about this. So you say, what's going on? What are the limitations? How can I change this? And then you will want to think about, present in your application about how you're going to try and make sure that you can do that as far as possible. So this is your key area. And then you can say, also in the section, one of the strengths in my study is this would be the first time when we've been able to get people from the National Department of Education involved in the study looking at sexual harassment in schools, and therefore that makes it much more likely our research findings will impact policy. So you can say that that's a key strength of the study and a really good thing for you to point out. What about in intervention research? If an intervention is being developed or tested or an existing one evaluated, we need to know about the intervention and know what you know about it. So have you done any preliminary research? What did you find? Has it been published? And how is your intervention expected to contribute knowledge that will help solve a problem, and the problem being the one that's just been described? You must put in a theory of change for an intervention if you want to develop an intervention, even if it's a tentative theory of change, because obviously putting together a full theory of change is part of your intervention development. But if you have an existing intervention that you want to have it researched, then there must be the theory of change there. You don't have to put it in the text. You can upload it as an annex and then just refer to it. And these theory of changes really are very nicely presented in diagrams. You must show an intervention is theory-based, because if we come in to read your proposal and think that you've just sucked it out of your thumb, then we won't fund the evaluation of the intervention. So you must show that you are familiar with what's been written about good practice, best practice in terms of interventions in the field. You've drawn on that in developing the intervention, and the intervention has been based on, or if you're developing it, will be based on an understanding about what are the risk factors and the key things that need to be done in order to bring out the change that you desire. So this is a very quick guide for a theory of change, but basically you start at the bottom with a problem statement of what you want to be addressed by the intervention. What do you think are the barriers to problem solving and sources of risk? What should be done to address the modifiable risk factors and assumptions? So the emphasis being on the word modifiable, because essentially you're not going to be in an intervention looking at addressing risk factors that are not modifiable. What are the elements of the intervention you're thinking of, and how do they map on to drivers? What will the activities be? What do you expect to be the consequences from the intervention, and how is that going to result in success? And obviously your success needs to speak to the problem statement. So this is a very brief outline of the headings that you want to cover. And as you develop the intervention elements, they must use good practice. So don't come and say you're going to develop posters and stick them up and people look at the posters and stop beating their wife, because we know that doesn't happen anywhere. You might raise awareness through doing that, but you're not going to change behavior. If you want to change behavior, you need to include tried and trusted methods of changing behavior, particularly with the emphasis on the use of participatory methods or other established methods such as motivational interviewing. And you need to end up with a clear statement of your aim and objectives. You're given 3,000 characters. Don't really expect you to ever use them. You've only got 4 objectives that you need to write, but you need to be clear about how you articulate these. And when you come to write your methods for the research, you'll obviously want to demonstrate how the methods map onto these objectives. So make them clear. You don't need to have any more objectives than are absolutely necessary to describe what you're trying to do. All objectives should be described in 1 sentence, and if it's valuable, you can put in another paragraph summarizing the need for the research and how the research will fill your Borg-VAC knowledge gap, but don't be repetitive. And then afterwards, we need to write the abstract. You provide an overall description of the study, and I recommend that you always write an abstract last, wherever it is you're required to present it in the application, because it's really important you have the most up-to-date information in your abstract. Brief statement of need for the problems, the methods you're going to use, and the goals. So 500 words, it's longer than an average peer-reviewed journal abstract, but it's not much longer. You need to show where the study comes from, and generally I recommend about 3 to 4 sentences where you show how you establish the need for the study. Choose your sentences with care, tell your reader what they don't know and not what they do know. So for example, tell your reader, it should be what you found from reviewing the literature that was important and would fill the knowledge gap. And if possible, if you've been what you know from talking to survivors or practice-based knowledge that leads you to filling the knowledge gap would be useful. Don't start off saying things like violence is a public health issue, violence occurs in all countries, because we know that. And you've only got 500 words, so tell us what you think your reviewer doesn't know. And when you articulate the gap, it's always worth thinking about an elevator pitch of 4 to 5 sentences. Why is it important for the study to be funded by the SVRI? What's known in terms of violence against research and thus where next? And the gap statement should leave the reader understanding and imagining already what methods you're going to be using. And it should follow the background statements. You need to summarize your goals in objectives, hopefully in 1 sentence, and then describe the methods. And you must put in detail what type of study, which country, how many people are you going to interview, who will they be, how will you recruit them, what are you going to ask them, how often are you going to interview them, is it once or more, how will you analyze the data, and then what are you going to do with the results. Obviously, we expect you to present to the SVRI forum, to disseminate to stakeholders. Tell us more about the stakeholders, because we do know you're going to present to the forum if we fund you. Are you going to use the results to build another intervention, a bigger research project? And, you know, essentially you need to say, what's the next thing that's going to happen? Is it going to impact policy? Is that what you think you're ready to use the results for? And I think I've reached the end of my time. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Rachel. It was amazing. I don't think we even had our eyes on the time, because this is exactly what we needed to get out to everybody who's planning on writing a proposal. That's wonderful. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. So I think we'll have to skip question and answers, but I think what we've gained instead of question and answers is far more valuable. So thank you for that. For everybody attending the webinar, we've tried to answer most of the questions that we got on the chats and question and answers, but you are very welcome to write more emails to us at svri@svri.org. And we will gladly get back to you within 48 hours of getting your email. So thank you very much, Professor Rachel, for joining us today and really giving us a detailed view on how to approach writing abstracts and how to do literature reviews. Thank you, everybody, and have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are from. Thank you for joining in.
Thank you, everyone.